Hello, so in this video we're going to talk about something that people have been asking about a lot, and it's input validation with React. So in a lot of other frameworks like Angular or anything else, there's a very clear way that you do input validation. In React, at first glance, it doesn't really look like any of those things, and input validation is actually pretty complicated. In terms of user experience. So what we're going for here is an input box that by default looks fine because you don't want to be throwing errors at the user as soon as they load the page. Also, we need it so that when they start typing, it doesn't immediately say it's wrong. So the rule for this is it has to contain the word React. So if we start typing foo bar whatever, and then we stop, it'll show the error until we actually fix it and type something with React in it. And then it shows that it's successful again. So what we want is simply something that's nice to the user and still lets us show them errors. So we're creating a component here called input, but first I'm going to scroll down a little bit and show you how we want the API to use, which is always the most important thing when trying to figure out a problem is the public API. So we want to use our input, we want to say whether it's valid or not. This should be a boolean, and here it's just if the index of is not -1. In other words, if it contains this word, it's valid. Then we have the value, which works like any other input with our onChange handler, and then we just gave it a placeholder. So that's pretty straightforward. That's pretty simple. We just want to be passing this data down into our input so that it can render it properly, and we don't want to worry too much about anything else. And because we're able to validate from the component that's using this input, or using many inputs or anything like that, we have the data accessible. It's not trapped within our validating component. And instead of using simple, silly things like this, you could use a validation library or an assertion library or whatever you like. So if we come up here, we need to look at how this is actually implemented to understand how it works. So there's one piece of state, and when I use state, it's either something that's an independent component in the application, or this state describes something that is private to the component. In this case, we have something called validation started, which helps us determine whether or not we should be showing an error message if the input is indeed invalid. We have this function which is by default empty, and it's called prepare to validate. So basically all that does is if our value is by default not blank, this is only run once for our input. If the value starts at something that's not blank, we want to just start validation right away. So if we come down here and we pass foo, this is presumably inserted some special way, or it's a default value or something, but it's invalid, and we want to show them that right away. So if we have our input and there's nothing in it, we want to prepare to validate it. We don't want to validate it yet. We don't want to show any warnings yet. We just want to prepare. So what we're going to do is use the low-dash debounce function, which simply prevents calling this. No matter how many times you call prepare to validate, it's not going to actually call the function until you've stopped calling it for 1 second. And you could change this to anything you like. When it is called, it just says validation is started. So validation started is false by default, and then once the user starts typing and then stops typing, we'll say validation is started, and we can show them warnings until they fix the value. We then come down to our render function, which is very simple. It says if validation is started, we want to either attach the valid or invalid class name to our input. And then that's just bound here. And we slightly wrap our onChange so that we can detect when they're actually changing the input. And if they are, we call prepare to validate. And then once we stop calling prepare to validate, it says we're ready to validate and validation is started. And then we simply call the prop onChange. So we're sort of overloading the prop in this situation. We're just intercepting it for a second and then passing it back up the tree. And then all this together is what gives us our nice validatable input. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.